Welcome back, AP GOV students. Today is Chapter 17 of Keeping the Republic, titled Environmental Policy. If you don't know Keeping the Republic, it's fine because the content is still going to be the same. I'm going to be going over all the key terms and notes for this chapter that helped me get a 5, so I encourage you to take notes along as well. Gross domestic product, this is just GDP, value of all goods produced in 1 year. It is the most significant and notable measurement to determine the success of a country's economy. Although GDP is the most common statistic, it's technically not the best statistic for measuring a country's economy. There are a few totally nerded out numbers and statistics and formulas that are better than GDP to measure an economy, but those are way over the head of me and all of you and everyone else in high school. But essentially what GDP measures is just how much is being produced at all levels of the economy, the local stores, the big national companies, and it takes all that up and adds it up, and it shows how active a country's or region's economy is. And a high GDP usually shows that there is a healthy economy and that businesses are producing at an efficient rate. Overheated economy, expansion of growth that outweighs supply. This happens when there is too much economic expansion in too little time, so the demand for products outgrows what is being produced. So if there's a massive boom in the economy, consumers have a ton of money in their pockets, they want a lot of new goods, it could outweigh what is being sold, and this could lead to shortages because companies don't have enough time to produce the amount of goods that the consumers want. It all comes down to the supply and demand graph. Inflation, when prices rise to match supply and demand. This hurts the economy because the prices of all goods have to increase in order to prevent shortages. So if there's a ton of money in the consumer's hands, the demand goes way up, but when the demand goes way up, the supply has to come up, but if it can't rise enough to meet the demand, the only thing for businesses to do is raise prices a ton to limit the amount of people buying products. This is why one of the main causes of inflation is government spending, because the more checks you give to people, the more welfare you give out and tax breaks, things like that, it puts more money in the consumer's hands, and businesses have to raise prices in order to prevent shortages. This is why a lot of the COVID policy advanced inflation in the country, because they were trying to keep the economy stimulated by putting money in the people's hands, but too much government spending was done in that time, and that's why inflation rose a ton. Recession, economic slowdown. This occurs when there is a considerable decline in GDP. A good example of this would be the 2008 recession, when the housing market collapsed, the stock market collapsed, businesses weren't producing as much, the GDP dropped a ton. Depression, more prolonged and consequential recession. Everyone knows what the Great Depression was. It is an extreme economic collapse that reaches levels only observed once in American history, again, the Great Depression. This is worse than a recession because the government or businesses can't do enough to rise out of it. It becomes a prolonged economic downturn, and there's a lot of economic suffering. Unemployment rate, the percentage of the labor force that is not working but is trying to work. It is a good statistic to look at when analyzing the health of an economy. If the unemployment rate is high, businesses are not doing well, and neither are the people. Because if the unemployment rate is high and no one can find a job, that usually means that businesses are not hiring, and when businesses are not hiring, that means they're not expanding or they're not making enough money to hire more employees. So if there's a high unemployment rate, the health of businesses in the country or area are not good. And that's why unemployment rate in combination with GDP are great statistics to look at when analyzing the health of a region. Fiscal policy, the government's power to tax and spend money. All government intervention in the economy falls under fiscal policy. The government has immense resources to affect the economy with spending bills. Although fiscal policy sounds like a weird term, it is a massive umbrella term for basically everything the government does. All government spending falls under fiscal policy. Every program that the government institutes, every tax break, tax cut, all that type of stuff is just fiscal policy because they're manipulating where money is going, how much money is going to certain places. All of that is fiscal policy. Keynesianism, I think that's how you pronounce it. The government can help the economy by how much it spends. This theory states that the government should pump money into the economy in times of downturn and withhold money in times of success. So essentially what this theory states is that when the economy is in a massive downturn, it's in a massive dry spell, if you pump money into the consumer side of the economy, consumers will start spending more money, and that will help businesses because they're buying more products, and that will raise out of the downturn. And then when the economy is doing well, you can withhold money. You don't have to give money to people when the economy is doing well because the economy can just ride it out. And this will prevent inflation if you don't continue to give money to people because they'll just use what they have and it won't rise inflation, things like that. And essentially, if you even out the times of downturn and the times of success, all the government spending and not spending will balance out, and you'll end up with a balanced budget. However, this basically never happens. What really happens under Keynesianism is that the government just ends up spending a ton of money, but that's kind of just where we are as a country, with the budget and the debt being massive. Monetary policy, controlling the economy through the money supply and interest rates. Manipulating interest rates controls how much money people have, which can either encourage or discourage spending and investment. So what this is the Fed, the Federal Reserve, controlling banks and their interest rates. If you raise the interest rates a ton on loans, less people will be taking out larger loans, and that stops more money from going to people, and that will curb inflation. But when the economy is in a massive downturn, you might drop the interest rates a lot, and that will encourage people to take out more loans and spend more money. Federal Reserve System, this is the Fed, commission that controls the money supply. The Fed is in charge of setting the interest rates, which is followed by banks, ultimately controlling how much money the people and banks have. I'm honestly still a little confused about how the Fed's interest rates affect, and the banks always follow what the Fed is doing. However, what you essentially have to know is that somehow, some way, by certain influences, the banks listen to the Fed when the Fed sets their interest rates. I think it's partly to do because the banks borrow money from the Fed and all that stuff, so their interest rates have to follow what they're borrowing and stuff like that. But anyways, the Fed, when they set their interest rates, banks follow them, and that's how interest rates are manipulated. Supply side economics incentivizes greater investment through tax cuts. Supply side economics are typically, the goal of this theory is to increase business investment, which will lead to greater production and result in more products at lower prices for the people. This is typically tied to more conservative economic policy. What this will do is either give money to businesses or lower regulation and cut taxes for businesses. The theory is that the businesses will use this extra money to increase investment and increase production and make production more efficient, and at the end of the day, this will drop prices, and that will benefit the people as a whole. However, there are problems with this theory because what businesses will do with the extra money is not always put it to greater production and helping to lower prices. They'll just end up investing it or using it for themselves in a way that doesn't have anything to do with production. Progressive tax system, taxes increase as income increases. America has a very progressive tax system. Money is separated into income brackets that are taxed at increasingly higher rates. There are a lot of misconceptions, I think, about the American tax system. We have a extremely progressive tax system. It's even more progressive. It's more progressive than even the most liberal countries in Europe. The top level tax bracket is extremely highly taxed. But essentially what a progressive tax system is that money is separated by brackets at certain cutoffs. So for example, this is not even close to what the actual brackets are, but 0 to 10 grand is taxed 0%, 10 to 20 grand is taxed 5%, 20 to 30 grand is taxed 10%. So the more money you make, the greater it is taxed. And what this helps to do is put less of a tax burden on people making less money and put more of a tax burden on the rich people making a lot of money. Deregulation, reducing regulations on businesses. Many people believe that engaging in deregulation will allow businesses to produce more products and therefore lower prices. This is tied to supply side economics. A lot of people believe that a lot of the bureaucratic regulations on businesses is just useless red tape, and this ends up hurting businesses and consumers rather than protecting consumers. So if you start to deregulate the business world, people think that it will take a lot of the inefficiency out of production, and this will end up helping businesses produce more products at lower prices, and that will lower prices for consumers. Antitrust policy, mitigating the monopolization of industries. This was a huge thing in the early 20th century with Teddy Roosevelt. The government has instituted many efforts to break up monopolies to create a fairer economy. So essentially what this is breaking up conglomerate businesses that control a massive percentage of a certain industry. A great example of this would be Rockefeller with Standard Oil. He basically controlled the entire oil industry, which allowed him to set prices however he wanted to because he didn't have any competition. So the government has passed laws on breaking up monopolies. Protectionism, favoring domestic business by limiting foreign imports. Proponents of this agenda state that homeland businesses should be protected by instituting greater tariffs and regulations on foreign businesses. So if you raise taxes and duties on foreign goods, foreign companies will have to raise their prices on their goods in order to reach their profit margins. So what this will do is always make foreign products cost more than domestic products, and these type of policies are introduced in order to, support American businesses. Free trade policies, putting less regulation on foreign trade. This is rooted in truer free market principles. It allows the market to decide on the prices of domestic versus foreign goods. Proponents of this policy believe that the best way to protect consumers is to allow foreign goods and domestic goods to compete fairly in the market, and consumers will pick which one is better. A lot of people don't like the idea of artificially raising prices on foreign goods just to protect American businesses. They should challenge American businesses to make better products than the foreign businesses. Trade deficit, difference between the value of imports and exports. This has been going in a negative direction in America, as the actual production of goods is mostly done overseas in almost every industry. One of the things with America, one of the trends with America, is that we don't actually produce a lot of anything in our country anymore. Because we have such an advanced economy, a lot of what we do is in the service industry and the research and behind the scenes stuff like that. We don't do a lot of on the ground producing little goods like clothes and toys, things like that. A lot of that is done overseas in the less advanced economies. So in order to get our actual physical products, we have to import a ton of things from other countries, and we don't actually export a lot of hard goods anymore. North American Free Trade Agreement, this is NAFTA, removed a lot of trade barriers. This is a victory for free trade policy. However, there are valid arguments about the impact that this has on the job market. What this did was open up trade between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and ultimately this lowered prices from goods traded between those regions. However, this started to greatly affect the job market, specifically between Mexico and the United States. For example, this would have a huge impact on farming, because obviously Mexico would have a lot better farming weather than America has. We can only really do farming in the southeastern regions. So a lot of those jobs down in the southeast region moved down to Mexico, and this hurt the American job market. Nuclear triad, nuclear weapons from ground, sea, or air. This is where the chapter kind of starts to pivot to foreign policy. The threat of nuclear weaponry is the most powerful and influential foreign policy. So as much as you can do on the diplomatic scene and things like economic relations and foreign relations, things like that, nuclear weapons are ultimately the best negotiating, resource that any country could have. If you have the facilities to eliminate any country that you want, it becomes the best bargaining leverage you can possibly have. Terrorism, mass violence on innocent people. The threat of terrorism is a major driver of American foreign policy decisions. Basically, since 9/11, all foreign policy has been is counterterrorism. We have massive interest in the Middle Eastern regions and Russia, things like that, when it comes to counteracting terrorism. A lot of American policy is balancing the relations in those Middle Eastern, Southeast Asian regions, because we rely on those regions for a lot of goods, and specifically oil, although a lot of those countries in that region have proxy states and terrorism, organizations that are living in those countries. How do we balance our interest between preventing terrorism but also how much we rely on these countries and regions for goods? Anti-terrorism, defending citizens against foreign policy threats. A lot of on-the-ground police and military work is done to protect people. A massive part of our intelligence community and police and military budget is done to prevent terrorism. Counterterrorism deters terrorists from using force. The government and military is very active abroad in containing terrorist threats in rogue states. Most of our military operations, specifically done in the Middle East, is counterterrorism based. North Atlantic Treaty Organization, this is NATO, everyone should know what that is. Body consisting of most of Europe and the United States. It united the developed Western world in the post-Cold War landscape. It influences foreign policy around the world. This is just a massive conglomerate of all Western developed countries. The United States is the biggest player in this organization, even though we aren't in Europe. This body controls all the foreign policy done within Europe and between European nations and other regions, specifically Russia and the Middle East. And naturally, with dealing with so many regions like this has a huge connection to economic policy and things like trade agreements. Cybersecurity, security measures on the internet. This is a relatively new sphere for the government to be involved in. It is becoming more important as the internet expands. As more people use the internet and as the internet becomes a greater player in all aspects of life, the government has a huge interest to make sure the cyberspace is secure and make sure that they're limiting crime and hacks and things like that. especially now as a lot of our government functions and a lot of business functions are done like based on the internet. They rely on the internet and AI. You have to make sure that those things are secure to prevent the country from basically being shut down just because of a hack. National debt, the money the government borrows. The government's debt is constantly increasing with no solution in sight. The debt conversation greatly influences fiscal politics, especially around budget setting. The budget seems to be a perennial talking point in American politics, especially because it's getting to the point where it's so bad. Every president recently has increased the budget. There isn't really a good solution for limiting the national debt other than slowly reducing spending. However, reducing spending seems to always be political suicide since no one wants their programs cut. That's a wrap. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next chapter, and goodbye. Yo, if you're super cool and awesome, you should follow my Twitter or X if you're that kind of person. It's at Clark4724. I post a lot of random stuff on there, but I also post channel updates and when my next videos are coming out. So if you're gonna keep watching my channel, then I recommend you follow, and thanks.